Well, good morning. We were giving folks a minute to log in. I want to thank you so much for coming to this webinar. We're very excited about it. It's the first of our series on building a better farm bill. And this particular session is going to be started with two amazing speakers. I'll let Piper introduce them later. Just wanted to get into some housekeeping really quick. Si necesita interpretación en español, haga clic en el globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Luego seleccione español y escuchará la transmisión simultánea de webinar interpretada por Rolando Acevedo. Agradecemos a Rolando para unirse a nosotros hoy y nuestros patrocinadores, new word for me, incluyendo la Fundación de Agricultura Regenerativa, por apoyar el acceso al idioma. And I'll put that in the chat too. It's about interpreting. If you need Spanish interpretation, you'll want to click the globe at the bottom. Also want to ask people to include your name and pronouns in your organization using the Zoom rename feature. Right click on your picture, select rename at the bottom, and include your, like I said, name, pronouns, and organization. And then also wanted to really quickly get into our community guidelines that are what we follow when we have webinars and our conference. And I will put the link in the chat, or somebody will put the link in the chat to a broader interpretation of these guidelines. But basically, one person, one mic, one person speaks at a time. No one knows everything. Together, we know a lot. Move up, move up. If you tend not to speak a lot, please move into the role of speaking more. If you tend to speak a lot, please move up into the role of listening more. We can't all be articulate at the same time. Take a center of culture of care. And that means lift each other up, take time to credit thought leaders for their contributions and acknowledge when ideas you're sharing originate from a fellow leader. And also be an active inquiry. Be an active inquiry about how your personal identities within the hierarchies of privilege impact and influence collective space. Also wanted to just say really quick before we kick off, like I said, we are very excited about this series. We know that farm workers are farmers, and that without them, we cannot move towards to build together a just, equitable, and ecological food and farm system, which is the mission of WFAN. And I'm excited to share that right before this webinar, I received an email from Sophie Eckhoff, who is the Farm Bill Campaign Director at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And basically she says, thanks to you all, we delivered a letter signed by 110 organizations detailing 10 actionable ways Congress can finally include farm workers and food chain workers in the Farm Bill, all squarely in the jurisdiction of the Farm Bill. And they sent the letter not only to legislative directors of the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Ag committees, but also the chief of staff and other officials at USDA and Biden's agriculture advisors. So they're going to keep us informed. But huge thanks to all the folks, and some of those folks are on this call. Thank you for your advocacy in this. And I will now hand it over to Piper.
Awesome news. Thanks so much, Jules, for kicking us off. I'm so excited to be able to start this Farm Bill Summer series at what seems to be a pretty perfect time with this new delivery to Congress from the Union of Concerned Scientists, but also just think we're right in the thick of Farm Bill time, and we seem to have somehow, by some miracle, made it to this part of the session. And I feel like these conversations are always worth having, but especially pertinent right now. So I'm really excited to turn things over to our two speakers today. Yahaira Caceres, who is from National Farmers Coalition, and Yahaira is the policy team manager focusing on the intersection of immigration and labor in the agricultural sector. And they attended the University of Florida studying political science and anthropology. But before they joined Young Farmers, they worked at America's Voice doing immigration research that focused on identifying trends and tracking xenophobic ads. And they've also been a union organizer at the Tampa International Airport, experiencing and witnessing labor violations as migrant farm workers have led them to pursue work that centers immigration and labor policy in the agricultural sector. and they strive to represent their community of Immokalee, Florida, by following work that benefits farm workers and immigrant workers. And so we are so excited to have Yahaira here from National Young Farmers Coalition. And we're also joined by Amy Tamayo from Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. And Amy is the National Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at Campesinas. And she advocates along farm worker women in advancing priorities in the areas of immigration, environmental justice, workers' rights, and ending violence against women. Amy's experience is in immigrant and migrant worker rights. And prior to her work at Alianza, Amy was a Justice Catalyst legal fellow at Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, where she focused on challenging gender and sex discrimination that women face during recruitment in the workplace. Amy's the daughter of immigrant parents from Mexico and is proud to be advocating for Campesinas communities. And I feel like we are in such good hands being able to talk about these issues today with the both of you, and also with all of the wonderful people that have joined us from organizations that support this work across the country. So I will go ahead and turn it over to whoever wants to start us off with presentations, and just remind everyone, if you feel like you want to hold on to some questions for the end, we'll have ample time for Q&A. So I encourage you to just keep those bookmarked in your head, write them down somewhere, and we'll open it up for Q&A at the end of both of our presentations today. So thank you so much.
I can go first. One second.
And can you see the National Young Farmers Coalition logo? Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jules.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Yahaira from National Young Farmers Coalition, and I'm so excited to be here and to give a presentation on building a more equitable future for U.S. agriculture. Next slide. So a little bit about Young Farmers. We are a grassroots coalition of young farmers, and we have around 45 chapters, roughly 3,000 members, and around 200,000 supporters across the country. And we're all helping to build a brighter and more resilient future for agriculture. Every 5 years, our coalition surveys young farmers and ranchers and growers across the country. Last year, we were able to survey 10,000 farmers. Many of them are past, current, and aspiring farmers. And they all identified under the age of 40. So that was pretty cool to see. We do this survey every year before the Farm Bill to understand what our farmers are experiencing. Based on the results, we then are able to create our Farm Bill recommendations, policy recommendations, and our priorities to be able to focus on our advocacy this year. And our coalition was formed in 2010 to create a unified voice for the future in federal farm policy. In the last decade, we have advocated for policies that have created a microloan program at USDA, secured historical funding for beginning farmer training and outreach for farmers of color, provided millions of dollars for farmland protection, invested in farmer mental health services, and provided accessible COVID relief, and so much more. Next slide, please. So our Farm Bill priorities and campaigns include land, climate, and USDA access and accountability. Access to land is the #1 challenge facing the next generation of farmers, and this barrier is even greater for BIPOC farmers. We are calling on Congress to make a $2.5 billion investment for equitable land access in the Farm Bill through our 1 million acres for future campaign. Our climate campaign is centered on young farmers and ranchers being on the front lines of the climate crisis and urgently needed concerted policy action. They need policies that encompass the depth of the climate crisis, solutions for climate resilience, and that support both vibrant agricultural communities and healthy watersheds. And when it comes to USDA access and accountability, federal programs are failing to reach and support the next generation of farmers and ranchers. So we are calling on the USDA to improve the customer service experience of young and BIPOC farmers, modernize and streamline processes, provide technical assistance, and then ensure programs and outreach are culturally responsive to young and BIPOC farmers. Next slide. So what is our strategy when it comes to our Farm Bill advocacy? First is organizing. We focus on organizing in districts and in states with representation on the House and Senate agricultural committees. Our field organizers in key states are aligning farmers with our theory of change and building strong networks ready to take action. The next is advocacy. And through our fellowships and trainings, we support farmer leaders to build strong relationships with their members of Congress, speak powerfully to the press, and mobilize their communities to take action. We also focus on communications. We amplify young farmer stories using like earned media, strategically timed communications. Our last Farm Bill campaign made front page news on the Washington Post, securing key visibility for our priorities at the right moment. Next slide. So what does our farm worker solidarity work look like? We are farmers in solidarity with farm workers. We do not lead in this work, but however, we do support our allies who do. We believe in a just future for agriculture depends on the recognition that farm workers are agricultural experts without whom farms cannot operate. We work towards the full recognition and respect of their expertise, rights, and freedoms. We use our power as a coalition of working farmers to amplify our work-led partners' priorities, including immigration reform for undocumented farm workers, farm labor protections, and more effective enforcement of labor violations. As a farm organization, we are committed to using our organizational power to amplify the work of our allies leading this work, including Farm Worker Justice, United Farm Workers, the Heal Food Alliance, and so many other organizations. We have been working to amplify their efforts to include workers in the pandemic or like relief bills, including through guaranteed paid sick leave, enforcement of safety and health protections by OSHA, pandemic premium pay, access to PPE, access to healthcare, a pathway to citizenship, advocating for undocumented people to have access to state driver licenses. We have taken meetings with the USDA to discuss the development of USDA Farm Labor and Farm Worker Working Group. And more recently, we have been helping advocate for the Protect America's Children from Toxic Pesticides Act. As we all know, like pesticides really affect farm worker communities, from the farm workers to also their families. And so we've been really excited about that work. Next slide, please. So our immigration and labor policy recommendations, like I was saying, in our national survey report, we come with recommendations that will set us up for this upcoming year for Farm Bill advocacy. And so our immigration and labor policy recommendations that we included include these two, but before I dive into them, challenging capitalism is one of young farmers' guiding principles, and capitalism favors profit and wealth accumulation over community needs and the social good, perpetuating consolidation, wealth inequality, and labor exploitation in the food and agricultural sector, despite despite contributing to our society in such a tremendous and essential way, a fact made obvious to everyone living through the pandemic, farm and food system workers face harsh working conditions, and many of them live in various hazards and challenges that surround them. Our mission of building a brighter and just future for agriculture is only possible when we work in solidarity to address these critical issues. All workers in the U.S. deserve full labor protections, especially farm workers and immigrant workers. No one in the workplace should ever feel powerless, not know their rights, or have someone infringe upon them. Supporting the transition of immigrants, farm workers, and the food system workers to farm ownership would also, and other agricultural roles, would also make our agricultural system more resilient and diversified, as many agricultural workers, especially farm workers, bring ancestral knowledge that is so beneficial to combating a lot of the issues that we see currently with climate change and things like that. And so we really acknowledge their expertise and their knowledge that they bring from their motherland. So our first recommendation is that Congress and the administration must work together to develop and enact comprehensive agricultural labor, as well as immigration reform that includes a pathway to citizenship for undocumented workers, food chain workers, and their families. Such reforms should also include improved labor protections for all farm and food workers, and more effective reporting and enforcement standards regarding violations of labor and human rights. And our second recommendation is that one outcome of the USDA Equity Commission should be a requirements for participation in USDA programs. This recommendation applies more for undocumented farmers, but it is a reality that undocumented farm workers wish to advance in agriculture by becoming farmers also deserve access to USDA programs. And there's currently widely inconsistent application of such requirements at the Department of USDA. So there's some programs where undocumented farmers can apply to, but there's others that don't. So then we're recommending that applicants and beneficiaries of USDA programs should be able to use any tax identification number recognized by the IRS instead of citizenship-based eligibility requirements. Regardless of citizenship status, farmers and farm workers should be able to benefit from resources through the USDA. Next slide, please. So what does farm worker advocacy look like in the Farm Bill? So we have recently endorsed the Farm Labor Exploitation Accountability Act that Senator Booker has introduced. This bill prohibits the USDA from engaging in contracts with companies that have committed egregious labor law violations and/or contracted with vendors that have incurred or failed to rectify serious worker or labor infractions. This act would require companies competing for contracts with the USDA to disclose labor and worker safety infractions by the company itself, as well as any of their contractors in the preceding 3 years. Empowered the Secretary of Labor to determine corrective measures for a company and/or their contractors to remain eligible for the USDA contracts. Required the Secretary of Labor to prepare a list of companies that are uneligible for USDA contracts for the year based on serious, repeated, and pervasive violations of labor laws, and is also established transparency measures to ensure USDA and the Department of Labor compliance. The focus on USDA is because Booker's office is attempting to get this included through the Farm Bill. This is huge because it would create precedent for the Farm Bill addressing labor issues, which it currently does not. It does not include farm workers, labor issues, anything when it comes to immigration. So this would set that precedent. USDA has historically served the interests of producers through initiatives and programs. And so farmers know that they can rely on the support of USDA on multiple fronts, such as guidance, training, research, education, and financial support. USDA provides producers with various safety nets to help them with, for example, weather challenges. And as a core constituency in the agricultural industry, farm workers should be able to turn to the USDA for help when they similarly face difficulties, and that's their livelihood, and their housing is often tied to their job and things like that. So yeah, so we believe that both farm workers and farmers should be able to turn to the USDA, especially in a time of crisis. Next slide, please. So to conclude, agriculture has been a pathway of opportunity for many generations of new Americans, and they should be able to climb the ladder from farm worker to farm manager to farm owner. Yet this position, land loss, market policies, and consolidation have dislocated so many people and communities from their connection, stewardship, and ownership of the land. There is still an opportunity for reconnecting and empowering a whole generation of new American communities to reclaim their agrarian tradition, be that on U.S. soil or abroad. I am proud to be a former farm worker, being raised as a farm worker. I am proud of my farm worker parents and my community. This growing up and seeing and experiencing like labor violations as early as the age of 14. And now looking back, I'm like, what was I doing? Like working as a farm worker on a farm. But there isn't protections setting us up or protecting us as children who work on farms, or the parents who are exposed to pesticides as farm workers. So there is so much growth in the agricultural industry to protect farm workers and their families. And it's so vital to keep our agricultural system sustainable in order to move forward, that we censor farm workers as well as farmers moving forward in a lot of solutions when it comes to what the farm bill should be addressing. And thank you for listening. Hopefully this was informational, and I'm glad to have this opportunity to share what my organization does and what we are currently working on. And we'll love to like work with organizations to continue supporting the farm worker movement of farm worker rights. So thank you so much. And I hope this all inspires us to continue to build a better future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Haida. There was a question in the chat, and that was a request for the slides. Will you be able to pass along the slides?
Of course, I can share them.
Great, thank you. And
thank you.
I appreciate you sharing your information on this last page too. So that's an email to get in touch with you, and then also Young Farmers is the handle for all social media purposes for National Young Farmers. Is that correct?
Yes, both on
awesome.
Instagram and Twitter. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And we'll make sure to share some follow-up information and any relevant links with everyone that's here. So don't worry if you don't get things written down before before the next presentation. But thank you so much for kicking us off, Yahaira, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing and for sharing your story as well. It's very powerful. So we'll pass it over to Amy Tamayo, who is from Alianza Nacional de Campesinas, to tell us a little bit more about the work that she does.
everyone. My name is Amy Tamayo, and I'm the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator with Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. We can actually just go to the next slide. Thank you. So Alianza Nacional de Campesinas shares a vision and a mission to amplify the voices of farm worker women and girls across the country. We're a national alliance, meaning we have member organizations, and we estimate that we represent about 700,000 farm working women and girls in the United States. And we really focus on uplifting their voices, their input, and their policy recommendations in our work. And Alianza was founded in 2011, and I can share a little bit about that history in the next slide. So Alianza Nacional de Campesinas started out as an organization just based out of California, and it started with a group called Mujeres Mexicanas back in 1989. And this came from a group of surveys that were done with farm worker women who were asked about some of the issues that they face in the workplace. And the people that were running this project, including Milly Treviño Sauceda, who's our executive director, saw that a lot of farm worker women were experiencing a lot of similar issues, similar concerns, and a lot of things that they felt pretty uncomfortable discussing because of cultural myths or cultural taboos, where it's not maybe appropriate in their upbringing to discuss domestic violence or violence in the home, violence and harassment in the workplace. A lot of the surveys showed that women were not aware that they had any worker rights. They thought that they were not entitled to any sort of minimum wages or any sort of protections. They didn't know who to reach out to for help or support. And they felt that doing the survey, a lot of women shared it was the first time that they were ever asked what their opinion was and what their input was to improve their working conditions. And so out of this survey and this group, it then turned into more of an organizing effort to provide a safe space for farm working women to gather and to organize, to share information with their communities, and to improve, their local education systems, their access to healthcare, and improve their working conditions. And this is sort of the progression of how we became Alianza. It turned into establishing different chapters of Líderes Campesinas, which opened the door to this becoming a national movement of different organizations. We can go to the next slide, please. So now that Alianza is a national organization, these are some of the organizations that make up our membership. We're currently made up of 15 member organizations across 20 different states. I know there's some folks on the call here from Líderes and from other groups, but this makes us, strength through our numbers, and there are different perspectives. Some of the member organizations are in different regions, which is really helpful for us to know what's going on, how the environmental impact is affecting folks, and to hear some of the different, perspectives in our advocacy. We can go to the next slide. So our advocacy, which is, I'll get into how we plug this into the Farm Bill in a moment, is focused in these 4 different priority areas. And these are the 4 different buckets that sort of have been identified as the biggest priority or concerns for our Campesina members. Gender-based violence, labor and workers' rights, immigration reform, and environmental and pesticide justice. And within these 4 different priority areas, we do different, campaign work, or we pull out different policy recommendations for different legislative bills, including the Farm Bill. But this is sort of how we organize our listening sessions, and where we gather input is we have working groups for each different topic, and we sort of have these focus groups divided by these categories in order to get pretty in-depth recommendations to plug into different advocacy efforts. Next slide, please. So before we can do any sort of policy and advocacy or policy or legislative advocacy with Alianza, we really focus on how we are organizing in the community. And this is, like I said, how we gather how we develop our policy recommendations. Some of that is done through food distribution. So when different member organizations go to different food banks and have conversations with folks, people will offer up ideas like, oh, it'd be great if we could use, our food stamps here, or if we could enroll through SNAP at these same events. Or we sometimes discuss gender-based violence through theatrical skits to make people more comfortable talking about sensitive issues. Doing outreach through different topics like COVID-19. Also, it helps us engage with the community and have conversations about some of the issues in their community. And then, of course, trainings. And we have really been focusing on this method of community organizing this year leading up to the Farm Bill, because a lot of people that we asked, what they wanted to see in the Farm Bill did not know what the Farm Bill was. They did not know how, something like the Farm Bill passes in Congress, how a legislative bill, gets to the point where it becomes a policy, or what a marker bill was. And so we took a lot of time starting from the very beginning on like, what is policy advocacy? What does this mean? And sort of thinking more abstract, like what would our ideal like agricultural policies look like? What would we want to include in them? And then from there, we were able to over time narrow it down to more streamlined and top line recommendations for the Farm Bill. We can go to the next slide, please. So all of those trainings that I just mentioned included a lot of in-person discussions, webinars online, listening sessions online, informational sessions. And we were able to kind of put a lot of this into practice in our most recent convening that took place in April. And this brought about 130 farm worker women to Washington, D.C. a few months ago, and also included about 30 to 50 virtual participants. And it was a 4-day event, and we focused the first 2 days on having 20 different workshops on different topics that are in the Farm Bill, including things that overlap with our priority areas. And these 20 different workshops were sort of designed like focus groups where people were able to sort of brainstorm policy ideas or concerns or questions that we would then be able to bring to, congressional members or the USDA to have follow-up conversations on. So you can go to the next slide to show a little bit more of that. So over the course of those 4 days, like I said, we had 20 different workshops that covered different topics within the Farm Bill, like nutritional assistance, research data, and we were able to also have about 50 meetings with different congressional offices to share some of these concerns and ideas that we came up with in these workshops. And here's some pictures of us in our workshops and meeting different folks on the Hill. That's with Senator Booker. And we also spent a day at the USDA where we were able to also share some of our concerns with the USDA programs that Yahaira mentioned in her presentation. And this was just such a powerful way to show, how the efforts of the past year that our Campesina members have been learning about policy advocacy, learning about what the Farm Bill is, and then coming to DC and doing this in-person advocacy was extremely powerful. And it required a lot of effort from everybody. As many of you know, farm workers typically don't get paid time off. Farm workers typically, don't have affordable childcare in their communities. They live in typically isolated areas. So getting childcare arranged, raising money for flights, for hotel, for food, for these 4 days in Washington, D.C. was just, it took villages upon villages for this to happen. And it was just like super, special for this many people to be in DC. And I'm pretty sure we broke a record by having 150 farm worker women and advocates in the USDA building. And so that was also really cool for people to be able to speak directly to leadership and for them to hear from the farm worker women. We showed up and we said, we don't necessarily, we'd love to hear what information you have. Tell us about what programs exist. But since farm workers are excluded from a lot of these programs, we really want to share with you our concerns, and you need to know about our reality so that you can change these policies so that they actually serve us, since we're such a key part of the agricultural industry. So that was just, like I said, this past April, and now we're doing a lot of follow-up and more targeted legislative outreach with specific offices or doing advocacy on specific bills that we're hoping will be included in the Farm Bill. And so I can kind of go into some of the specific recommendations that we shared during the convivencia and that we've been, still sharing and since, and we're hoping to continue sharing and getting into the Farm Bill. We can go to the next slide, please. So these are sort of the areas where our recommendations tend to focus in. And the first title of the Farm Bill, or one of the biggest titles of the Farm Bill, is the nutritional assistance title. And the reason we advocate under this is because we know that a lot of farm workers do not earn, they're excluded from the FLISA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. They're included from a lot of state minimum wage and overtime laws. And, when it rains or when there's extreme weather, they just they don't work a full 40-hour week. And so food insecurity is a big concern in farm worker communities. And even though there are a lot of nutritional assistance programs like SNAP, for example, you are not eligible if you do not have some kind of immigrant status. And while you can still apply for, maybe your children, if your children are United States citizens, a lot of families are intimidated by applying to these programs because they're like, well, what does this mean for me? Are they going to know that I'm undocumented, or is there going to be some sort of consequences? There's a lot of fear around asking for help when you don't have status, even if you maybe still might be eligible for that type of resource. So some of the things that we're advocating for is that there be more outreach on the programs that folks who are undocumented can still benefit from, whether it's through their children or through their spouse, and for immigrant status to really just not be like a requirement at all. That would be our top ideal ask, but we know that might not happen anytime soon. And so we're recommending ways that folks can still get the information in a language they understand, that outreach is being done by Spanish speaking folks, and that the programs just be a little bit more inclusive. Some of the other issues that we see in the nutritional assistance topic is that a lot of farm worker communities don't have access to fresh and healthy foods, despite the fact that they are producing it or harvesting it or packing it every day. Some of our Campesina members share that they have to commute an hour and a half to a grocery store, or some families who are able to have SNAP or food stamps or even be on the WIC program, they do not live close to any like markets that actually take that. They're maybe closest to like convenience stores, or sometimes the food is just out of their budget because of the low wages that they earn. So those are some of the things that we're trying to be creative and asking for, more programs to be income-based, or for food distribution to be a little bit more widespread and better subsidized. We're also asking for farm workers to be considered in the research and data funding that gets set aside in the Farm Bill every year, or every Farm Bill. We feel that a lot of research is not really catered or centered around farm worker issues, despite the fact that a lot of agriculture policies affect the most vulnerable farm workers, and that means that there's not a lot of accurate data on the effects of pesticides on farm workers. As a farm worker women's organization, we hear from so many members that women are experiencing a lot of reproductive health issues, infertility, miscarriages. Their children are being born with disabilities or neurological challenges, autism, asthma, like a lot of different types of respiratory conditions. And a lot of adult farm workers are reporting cancer that isn't necessarily being diagnosed as caused by pesticides, but they think it might be caused by pesticides because of the respiratory challenges that they experience. But a lot of this data is not being collected. And a lot of the funding that is set aside in this title of the Farm Bill is given to institutions like universities or other NGOs that don't necessarily collaborate with organizations that are in the community, or they don't really find a way to understand the cultural context of the farm worker communities and are not getting the information that is the most accurate, that would really, produce data that could help drive changes in policies that could better protect farm workers. In the rural development section of the Farm Bill, we're advocating for significant changes being done to the infrastructure where farm workers are living. That includes improving housing, whether that be affordability, the fact that there is a shortage of housing for farm workers, and we see that a lot of farm workers are living in very crowded housing with very poor ventilation, which is really challenging when it's, we're seeing heat stress happen more and more every year, and folks are having heat stress or heat stroke even when they're in their homes because their bodies just cannot cool down after working, and they go home, their bodies just continuously unable to cool down because they don't have properly ventilated homes. And that can be either an employer provided housing or the only housing that they're able to afford close to their work. We're also seeing people reporting that they don't have, reliable internet, which was really challenging during the pandemic when children had to take school from home. Some farm workers say that their school buses, their kids' school districts don't have buses that come out to their homes anymore. The water is constantly being found to be, poisoned by mercury or other pesticide drift from the fields. So, and again, this could also overlap a little bit with the research and data that needs to be done in this, but the infrastructure needs are pretty high for farm workers, and typically the rural development infrastructure funding goes to supporting businesses in the area and developing businesses, but it tends to overlook the folks that are living in these areas. And I know you had touched on land access a little bit, but we're advocating for, more access to the programs that are designed for minority farmers that are in, USDA loan programs. A lot of our farm workers in the United States come from countries where they maybe were farmers themselves, but that experience is not counted. So when a loan program says you need 3 years of experience as a farmer to qualify for this beginner farmer loan, it's really frustrating because farm workers are experts. They've been working for maybe decades, or, they have this ancestral knowledge from when they were farming in their home countries, and it's just not counted as experience. Or the fact that they are undocumented might mean that they're not able to qualify for loans. And even though there are some loan programs that you can apply for that don't require you to disclose your status, eventually they require you to show that you have some sort of lawful presence. And so even the most flexible loan application programs tend to create pretty big barriers for undocumented farmers to become farmers. And this is even happening at a smaller level, where we're seeing local ordinances, prohibiting or not setting, where a lot of farm worker women tend to engage with more because of the other barriers that I just mentioned. We've had some farm worker members share that in Florida, the community gardens that they used to work in and teach some of their farming practices to other farm workers are now being shut down. In a lot of labor camps or employer-provided housing, they're being given pretty strict rules where they can't even garden in their front yard. So growing even, herbs that they're used to growing from their homes and creating, that they use for medicinal properties or that they use to pass on cultural practices to their children are just not being permitted. And so the access to land and the access to just carry on your farming culture has been very difficult for farm worker communities. And so that is a big part of our advocacy. And I would say the other big bucket where we are doing a lot of advocacy is the USDA's farm worker coordinator position, which is currently in the Office of Partnership and Public Engagement. However, there is one farm worker coordinator for the entire country, representing all farm workers in the country, and that is just not enough. We have over, I think, 2.5 million farm workers in the United States. That could be, a little bit low for underreporting purposes, but the current farm worker coordinator, while, we've worked with her, she helped us set up our day at the USDA. One person is not enough. There should be funding set aside for a fully staffed office that is able to have the capacity to do, outreach with farm worker communities, to help connect them to agencies to get information on the programs that, were mentioned, the nutritional assistance programs or the loan programs, technical assistance in Spanish or indigenous languages that are spoken by a lot of farm workers. And, right now, I think a lot of advocates are looking at this farm worker coordinator and seeing a lot of opportunity here. Maybe it wouldn't necessarily remain in the same office. We're thinking about a farm worker office, maybe, where there would be liaisons of different agencies so that farm workers could also be a part of this office, whether through a farm worker advisory council or farm worker representatives participating. But we do think that this office needs to include a bigger voice directly from farm workers. And this would also hopefully over time create a more trusting relationship between farm worker communities and the USDA, which we know that they've had a lot of, they've had a challenging history, a discriminatory history towards people of color. So these are some of our main line recommendations. We have some others, but I'm happy to take questions. But I appreciate the opportunity to share some of our views and our perspectives, and I hope that some of this was helpful and that we can work together on it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing. And I just really, it's so powerful to see 150 farm workers at the Capitol. And that seems like no small feat in any way to get that many people in the same space, and extremely worthwhile endeavors, like to really show folks who is building our food system and foundational to our food system in the United States. So thank you so much for your work, and thanks for both of you for sharing hopefully some, I feel like, hopeful measures that we can be taking. I would like to open things up for questions, and if folks don't have questions, I'm happy to kick those off. But if you would like, since there's quite a few people, you can either drop questions in the chat and we'll keep an eye on that, or if you want to raise your hand, we can just ask you to unmute from there. So yeah, I would love to open it up for questions that you have for either presenter or both presenters here about the work that they do and the bills that they're talking about, or the advocacy work that they're talking about. Well, maybe I'll go ahead and start off questions. So you talked a lot about it, at least Yahida, you talked about the Child Labor Exploitation and Accountability Act as a bill that Young Farmers is really keeping an eye on. Are there any other specific bills that either of you would point folks toward to keep an eye on, or to talk to the representatives about advocating for as we move closer to the Farm Bill, or any marker bills that have been coming up recently for you?
I think yeah, the Child Labor Exploitation Accountability Act has been the main bill that I've seen that is tackling like farm worker issues, that is focused on like getting into the Farm Bill. But other than that, I think like which is like the Pesticide Act, is really another one to support and like talk to your representatives about. But other than that, yeah, I think those are the two main bills that I'm aware of.
I can add a few others that Alianza has endorsed and also been involved in some advocacy. Just yesterday, Dr. Raul Ruiz's office, representative from California, introduced the CARE Act, which is the Children's Act for Responsible Employment and Farm Safety. And this act is proposing to raise to set a minimum employment labor violation, to raise the maximum employment labor violations for employers, and to raise the standards in the agriculture industry for children, because as of now, children as young as 12 can work as farm workers. However, we know that there are children as young as like 9 working as farm workers. And so there's a lot of accidents, a lot of injuries, children like losing fingers, losing limbs, or being sexually harassed or abused in the workplace. And so we're hoping that legislation like this will protect children who have to, either out of necessity or, for whatever reason, have to work. We've also endorsed and been involved in advocacy for PACPA as well. The Justice for Black Farmers Act, the Opportunities in Organics Act, as we really would love to see less pesticides being used in the field. We know that this really affects the health and safety of not just farm workers, but their families. Exposure sometimes happens super easily without thinking about it. You know, someone might have something on their shoe and they'll bring their shoe inside, or you'll accidentally do laundry with someone that worked in the field with the rest of your family, and then now everybody has had allergic reactions. And you know, as undocumented farm workers, many don't have health insurance or the means or resources to get healthcare. So reducing the use of pesticides is being supported by the Opportunities in Organics Act or the OFF Act as well. So those are some of the ones that we've been asking Congress to support and include some language of into the Farm Bill.
Awesome, thank you both. And we'll be compiling these. So if you're feverishly writing like I am, don't worry, you'll have another chance to take a look at all of this. We'll send a follow-up email, and we'll hopefully have by the end of this series a nice database of resources and also bills that folks have been mentioning that we can point you to on our website. So yeah, I really appreciate those resources. We have a question in this, like a similar vein from Caitlin, asking which Congress people have been consistent allies on the issues that you work on. Yeah, if you want to talk about those folks from your experience on the Hill.
Yeah, so some of our, I mean, I will say we've been, we feel that a lot of offices have been willing to engage with us. Like we had 50 visits, and for the most part, I would say like 99% of them pretty well. And a lot of folks were interested in learning about farm worker issues or supporting some of our asks. Some of the offices that we've had repeated conversations on that we feel are really trying to drive new language have included Senator Padilla, who's shown a lot of interest in, you know, improving the ways that the farm worker coordinator could support farm worker communities. Representative Dr. Raul Reese, who I just mentioned, he has a farm worker history as well, and so he's very committed and passionate about some of these issues. Representative Salinas from Oregon has a lot of experience working on reproductive health issues for farm worker women, so we definitely see her as an ally. Congresswoman Brownlee from California has shared a lot of interest in land access, which we think has been great. That's been something that's it's been tough to move. And so those are some of the folks that we see as hopefully champions in this upcoming Farm Bill.
Also Representative Booker, and then also Representative Carvajal from California. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And we've got another question here from Margaret in the chat. Do you have a sense of how engaged Department of Labor agencies have been in these ongoing Farm Bill negotiations or in any Farm Bill advocacy related conversations more broadly when we talk about labor in the Farm Bill?
I mean, to be like frank, it's really hard to talk about labor in the Farm Bill. I think that you're immediately met with like, oh, that's a different committee, oh, that's a different bill, like we don't want to touch it, right? It's tough. However, you cannot pass like the most comprehensive agricultural like piece of legislation and not talk about farm workers and labor issues, because they are the key to keeping the agriculture industry running. And so for us, like we have had conversations with the DOL, and we do think that, you know, given what we are recommending that there be more interagency collaborations with the USDA and the DOL. We see that as an opportunity to have the DOL a little bit more involved in some of the equity issues and some of the community engagement, whether that be gathering more data on farm workers themselves, whether it be like statistics on how many are there, how many are experiencing labor violations, you know, gathering data that is not being gathered at all, or like just very sporadically. So that's one way that we're kind of trying to engage with the DOL. And we do recognize that, you know, from past administration, a lot of these interagency task force were not like working or were not in place. And so we know that they are catching up. But that is one way that we're hoping to involve the DOL more, and to also include some of our labor asks in the miscellaneous section of the Farm Bill. While it says miscellaneous, we know that a lot of key things have made it into the Farm Bill in that section and have now become its own title of the Farm Bill. Like some of the pesticide stuff has ended into the Farm Bill like that. And so not that we're like trying to sneak in anything, it's just that sometimes it's really hard for things to have a place in the Farm Bill. And so we're trying to be creative in how do we advocate for workers without necessarily labeling it as like a labor section of the Farm Bill, even though there should be, we believe there should be a labor section of the Farm Bill.
Yeah, thank you for kind of, talking that through and talking about this, maybe strategies behind how we actually get meaningful labor, solved. Sometimes we have to take the circuitous scenic route to get there, maybe. So a question that I'm wondering about, especially for folks that are on this call that are maybe like really new to Farm Bill advocacy or understanding their role in advocacy for the 2023 Farm Bill, is maybe and I can write this one in the chat too so that you have it in front of you, but maybe could you both suggest like what would you suggest for people to do if they have 5 minutes, if they have an hour, if they have a day, or if they have a week to like put toward this kind of work? Just like at those varying levels, being able to catch people's attention for 5 minutes is pretty exciting. But what advocacy recommendations or opportunities might exist for people at these like different levels of engagement?
I can start with a few and then pass it over to Yahaira. I think if you have 5 minutes, we all have, most of us have smartphones or access to internet. We can go on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, uplift a lot of these marker bills that we mentioned that are on more specific issues like packed buck hair, share things onto your story, give it a like, so like engaging with that type of content can get more eyes on it. I think a lot of people, especially when it comes to farm worker issues, just don't think about farm worker issues. They think of big ag or they think of farmers, and so, going onto people's organizational pages and uplifting things, tuning into these webinars or sharing them to share information, signing onto the sign-on letters, or if you're able to be the person in your organization to be like, hey, there's this effort to uplift this letter that like the one that was just sent out last week by the Concerned Union of Scientists. So those are some like short ones. Other ones include like if you're able to provide collaborative like resources, whether you can offer to translate or interpret for things or provide donations for things, all of that, or even creating the space for folks to talk. If you're having a panel or a webinar, invite somebody like a farm worker to speak and provide interpretation services. Those types of things would really be a lot to amplify the conversation, to be a little bit more inclusive and give a space for these important asks to be elevated.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. Like letting your representatives know, and maybe not reaching out to the representative themselves because we don't know if they're gonna like see your email or like call. But I know someone you could reach out to is their legislative assistants who focus on agricultural issues, like letting them know like, hey, I am a constituent, I am from this area, like you're my representative, like we really care about these issues. and then also just amplifying like those acts or bills like in the email or call, and just being like, hey, I care about this. I just want you to be aware of this like act or bill, and we really care about it. And yeah, I think that goes a long way because they do listen, and especially if you have a few of you and your friends doing it. And also when it comes to like knowing about like what else is happening in the Farm Bill, like advocacy spaces, I think, yeah, listening to webinars, listening to any hearings that you come across. But yeah, I think a lot of what Amy said, I agree with.
And I'll also offer, we'll give more information at the end, but we'll be having a session in 2 weeks on Wednesday, the 28th of June. That's going to be focused completely on advocacy and action, hopefully taking some tools that you all have talked about here and extending on, how folks can do those in their own communities and maybe understand their role in the Farm Bill in a really comprehensive way. So stay tuned for that. I'll drop the information about that in the chat as well. But if you're looking for some really concrete tools, I think coming to hear about the work that folks are doing is a great first step. And there's a lot of second steps out there for folks to take.
Well, I know that this is a long webinar for some folks, and I just wanted to give the opportunity to ask one more question or any other questions. And if there aren't any, then I will transition back over to Piper to wrap us up and invite you to the next.
Awesome. Yeah, and feel free if folks have questions following up this webinar. I'll drop our WFAN info at email in the chat, and we can connect you to one of our fantastic speakers, or we can connect you to the work that they're doing in their coalitions and across the country, and hopefully get you engaged with this work in some other way. But I just want to thank you all for joining us, and thank Yahaira and Amy for taking so much time to educate and advocate in the work that they do every day, and also with us this last hour and some change. And also thanks to Rolando from Denver Translation and Interpretation for offering some interpretation services today. I really appreciate all of the work that you all do, and I'm very grateful to be in collaboration and community with you all now. So feeling pretty hopeful leaving this session, which is an exciting feeling when we talk about the Farm Bill. So we'll be posting recordings from this full Farm Bill series following its conclusion on our website, and we'll probably send these recordings out to folks that were registered for this event prior to that. So just keep an eye out in your email for just a nice long list of resources and recordings that you can access from us. And yeah, I invite you to join us for our next session. This is a 4-part series. So we kicked it off today with farm workers and farm worker rights in the Farm Bill. And our next session will be talking about Farm Bill advocacy and action. That'll be with NFFC, National Family Farm Coalition, and NSAC, National Sustainable Agricultural Coalition, June 28th. So 2 weeks from now, but Wednesday, June 28th from 12 to 1:30 Central Time. And I'll drop the link to that in our chat. After that, we'll have 2 sessions in July, one focused on conservation in the Farm Bill, and then another focused on soil health in the Farm Bill. And we don't have a crystal ball, so we can't really tell what will be next for the Farm Bill between now and then, but I think that we'll probably have a much different understanding by our July sessions of kind of what's what, hopefully. So I really appreciate you all being here, and thank you again for our speakers for starting off this series for the summer. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. Be well.